Welcome to the Microsoft Australian OEM team webinar for Windows Server for June 2016. In this webinar, we'll be revisiting some of the basics of Windows Server 2012 R2 Essentials and the Windows Server Essentials experience. So part of this is based around some of the offers that are currently in market, as well as starting to prepare for those of you who are thinking about Server 2016 and have looked at some of the essentials capabilities in there. So even though we've touched upon some of those and I've covered some of those in previous blog posts, we'll talk about some of them again here in terms of some of the opportunities around attaching Office 365 to these. So adding Office 365 services to Essentials is an important part of this. And what we'll do this time around, which we haven't done in one of the previous webinars, is spend a few minutes going through the different Office 365 plans that are available. So we won't go through all of them because, as those of you who are working with Office 365 know, there are a few different plans available. So instead we'll focus on the primary ones that might be of interest to your SMB customers. Then we'll move on and just a quick recap of some of the upcoming changes that are happening with the Essentials role in Windows Server 2016. Then we'll wrap up with a quick conversation around upcoming events from Microsoft Australia, and then finishing up with the different resources you can take a look at to get more information on some of the things we've spoken about today. So Windows Server 2012 R2 Essentials, it's been in market for a while now, but for those of you who aren't familiar with it, we'll go through the three key pillars here. So the three key pillars are protecting your data, providing secure remote access, and integrating cloud services. Now, in earlier webinars, we've focused on some of the protect your data piece. It's been a heavy focus of previous in-person events that we've done. So this time around, we'll be focusing more heavily on integrating cloud services and why you may want to do that. So if we just spend a few minutes on that now, this is really about having conversations with your customers to start thinking about what makes sense to move it to the cloud and when. So it's going to be very rare that you can walk into a customer environment and say, it's time to move everything to the cloud. Instead, there'll be particular pieces of technology that for one reason or another you may want or need to keep on premise, but there'll be other technologies that you start thinking, well, it kind of makes more sense to move these out to the cloud, because if you've got people accessing the services more frequently when they're outside of the network as opposed to in the network, some of the benefits of cloud technology can really be leveraged in those types of scenarios. So let's take a look now at the different ways we can deploy Windows Server Essentials. So the first way is we can do it as a physical deployment. So we'll go through these in a bit more detail as we go through, but this is effectively just a bare metal installation. So kind of the traditional / legacy way of deploying servers that people have been doing for a very long time. Then we've got the Windows Server Essentials virtual deployment. So the Windows Server Essentials role or Essentials product also now includes the ability for you to use that with Hyper-V, but I'll spend a few minutes on this one because it's not a simple checkbox option. So I'll spend a few minutes talking about this as we go through the slides so that you can get an understanding of what's required with that. And then the final option here is, as hopefully you know by now, but if not, hopefully this is good news for you. Windows Server Essentials is available as a role inside of Windows Server 2012 R2. And on the next slide, you can see in this screenshot that inside of Windows Server 2012 R2 Standard or Data Center Edition, we've got the ability to go through and just enable Windows Server Essentials as a the Windows Server Essentials experience as a role, and that will go through and install all of the other components that are required. So if you think about the additional features that are required around setting up remote access services, around setting up web portals for remote web access, for example, these are things that the Essentials experience handles all of those dependencies for you. So as you can imagine, there's a fair bit that goes on behind the scenes when you do enable that role. And it means that if you've got customers who are larger than 25 users, you've got the ability to keep using Essentials as you move forward. And we'll talk about the in-place upgrade process as we keep going through these slides. So let's keep going and covering some of the different deployment scenarios. So the typical primary server deployment. So in this case, someone says, look, I just want to do a bare metal installation on top of the hardware. And as you'll see in these scenarios, I'm just using an example of planning to connect these into Office 365, which we'll cover as we keep going through. So this is a replacement for peer-to-peer networking and for previous servers that people may have been running. Sometimes you'll find that you can get some great deals around Windows Server Essentials being included with hardware. So it may be pre-installed, it may be available via ROK, or those of you who prefer to build your own also know that it's available through the OEM channel as well. So in this case, we can run some apps on the local server. Now, what we need to be aware of here is, when we do talk about running apps on the server, they need to be apps that know that they're running on top of Windows Server Essentials. So some of the things you need to think about here is that this is a role with some specialized features. So it's got things such as Active Directory domain services running on it. So if you want to install something that's not compatible with being installed on a domain controller, that's not something that you'll be able to install directly here on top of Windows Server Essentials. So that leads into some of the other scenarios that we'll talk about as we go through the following slides. One of the big targets for this type of deployment, though, or for the Essentials deployment, is looking at, well, what are the things we need to keep local? So maybe high-speed file services. Maybe we still want to do the print services through Windows Server. But the other big part of this is that we want things like a simple console that integrates with the cloud services that we're using, in this case, Office 365. We want local Active Directory capabilities. We want user passwords and usernames syncing to the cloud. And this is really one of the big pushes around Windows Server Essentials, and one of the reasons why it's out there in the marketplace today. As we then move on to the next deployment scenario, you'll see that this one builds on the previous one, but instead of running on bare metal, instead we're running on top of Hyper-V. So we've got a couple of different ways that we can achieve this. So the way that you need to think about it is, if you do want to run Windows Server with a GUI as the underlying hypervisor, you can't apply that after the fact, after it's been installed. So there's documentation up on the MSDN site around deploying Windows Server Essentials in this type of scenario, where there is work you have to do during the pre-install of the operating system, where you have to strip out a lot of the additional functionality that Essentials installs, so that you can install the base version of Windows Server that's included, along with the Windows Server Hyper-V role. Then once you've got that going, then you can deploy Windows Server Essentials into a child partition, or effectively a VM, inside of that virtual machine. So if you take a look at the diagram here, on the left-hand side, we've got the parent partition. So this is effectively the partition where we're running the Hyper-V role. And then on the right-hand side, we've got the child partition. So this is where we're actually running Active Directory, the Essentials dashboard, and the other capabilities that we've got inside of Windows Server. So just be aware of that one, in that it is something that there is work involved in getting this set up. So sometimes OEMs may do this as the pre-work, but sometimes it might be something that, if you want to leverage this type of scenario, that you need to do that work yourself. Then as we move to the next scenario, this is where somebody might have standard or data center. So if they're looking at Essentials, I'm going to lean towards them running standard in most cases. What they can do here is quite easily install Windows Server Standard, enable the Hyper-V role, and then install the additional 2 virtual machines. And on one of those VMs, they can install the Essentials role, which will be looking after things like their Active Directory domain services, giving the Essentials dashboard, providing the backup services, etc. And then we've got that second child partition. So once we've got that second child partition, or a virtual machine running, it means we've got a lot more flexibility around what we can start doing in this environment. So just to have a quick, this is a simple representation. Obviously, there are more scenarios than what we're providing here. But as I mentioned, in this first virtual machine, this is where we've got standard running with the Essentials experience role enabled. So this is the server that will be accessed for remote web access, the backup, email integration, dashboard type functionality. It will be the Active Directory domain server. It will be the DNS server, etc. Now, for a smaller organization, that's really not a lot of load to place on a single server. So there's no real concerns about doing that. In the past, those of you who ran small business server know that with running things like SQL and Exchange, etc., that even though it may not have been something that complied with all the the best practices around isolating workloads, it was definitely something that could be achieved. Now, when we take a look at the second virtual machine, what you need to think about with this one is that this is effectively up to you to figure out what you want to do with that. And that's really going to be dependent on that customer's requirement. So some of the scenarios they've got here, such as setting it up as an Exchange server, setting it up as a SharePoint server or a WSUS server, using it as a SQL server for a line of business app, or one of the ones that's still very common is using it for remote desktop services. So the use of remote desktop services here is obviously still a very, very popular option, and this is one of the ones that when we chat to people who are looking at making decisions around Windows Server Essentials versus Windows Server Standard, a lot of the time the piece of the conversation that steers the conversation towards Windows Server Standard is remote desktop services. However, now with some of those RDS and remote app type scenarios being achievable with different cloud solutions, this is something where some people are saying, well, look, we actually just want the bare minimum functionality on-prem, so we may just want to stick with Essentials. But for those who want to keep more of the infrastructure on-site, then you definitely want to be looking at Windows Server Standard as the entry point. Earlier I mentioned that you've got the ability to do an in-place upgrade of a Windows Server Essentials installation up to Windows Server Standard or Data Center and maintain the ability to keep using the Windows Server Essentials dashboard. So this is something that's called the in-place license transition, and it allows you to go through, and they give a maximum supported limit of 100 users and 200 devices. So in a lot of cases, that's a very large portion of the Australian marketplace. What's important to note here, and it's not one of the things we discussed earlier because it might be common knowledge to some of you, but it obviously isn't going to be obvious to or be known to everyone. But the other thing that's important here is that with Windows Server Essentials, it includes 25 CALs. So the CALs are basically included in the base price. As soon as we start breaking this out and doing the transition, we lose the CALs and instead we have to conform with Windows Server CAL requirements. So if we were doing this in-place upgrade to move from 25 users to 26 users, for example, that means that we need to go through and buy 26 Windows Server CALs when we do go through and do this in-place upgrade. Now, these features can be removed, so if you get to the point where you don't need those features, where some of the things that you want to run maybe have support statements around not officially supporting Windows Server Essentials, you've got the flexibility just to remove those features because they are just roles inside of Windows Server. So now that we've spoken about some of the Office 365 reasons, some of the different workloads, let's start digging into them in a bit more detail. So we'll start off with just a high-level overview of what the integration gives us. Then we'll spend a few minutes going through some of the different plans that are available. Now, if you're not aware of it, there are some very extensive lists of the different features of Office 365 plans, and they are available through aka.ms/O365SD, so for Office 365 service descriptions. And that gives a great deal of information around what's included in the different Office 365 plans. So when you're trying to pick and choose which one to apply, if you're not sure if a particular feature is in the mid-size plan, the business plan versus the enterprise plan versus Exchange Online, then that's the location that really should be viewed as the gospel or the source of truth. So go back to that to get that information that's required. So as we take a look at what the Office 365 integration features are, well, the goal of this is to really give a simplified admin interface. So what it will do is give you a very easy option to start connecting your Office 365 accounts that already exist to on-prem Essentials accounts, or alternatively to use Essentials to start building out new accounts in Office 365. And if you've already got the license purchased, you can then pick and choose which licenses you want to start assigning to different users. So one of the things that's important to understand here is that when it comes time to actually start assigning the licenses, it's not just necessarily your Office 365 license that you can assign. So you may not necessarily want someone to have access to every feature inside of the Office 365 license they have. So you can get granularity so that you may choose not to allow them to deploy Office. You may choose to give them Exchange Online but not SharePoint Online, depending on the plan that you've got. But the other thing you can start doing here is that for other Microsoft Online services that uses your Active Directory, you can also start assigning those licenses through here. So if you've got things such as the components of EMS, so Intune, Azure Rights Management Service, or Azure Active Directory Premium, if you've got CRM Online, for example, these are things that you can start assigning very easily from within the dashboard. So you add a new user, and then you can basically pick and choose what licenses you want to assign to that user. Now, what also happens from there is you can then start using Essentials to basically be where the users can change passwords, etc., on their own network, and then those password changes will then be replicated up into Office 365 very quickly for them. So this is something that's very easy to use. It gives you they call it the at-a-glance view of the Office 365 subscription, so you can see the number of licenses you have, the number of licenses that have been that are in use, most active, or the largest mailboxes, for example. You get some access into some basic configuration of SharePoint document libraries. So there are some very basic things that you can do directly within the dashboard. Now, it's important to note that because Office 365, from a feature and an admin perspective, it's an always moving target. So for most things where you need to do some kind of customization of SharePoint, for example, you are going to go into SharePoint Online and make those customizations as needed, rather than doing it at the admin dashboard inside of Essentials. But this is a great way to get you up and running so that you can get things going, maybe as you then sort of face the learning curve of exactly what Office 365 can do for that customer. So let's keep going and talking about some of the additional features that we've got here. So when we take a look at Exchange Online, so this is available as a plan where if you've got someone who says, look, for now I just need mail, even though it's great that there are all of these other Office 365 capabilities available, all we really want for now is to start using email in the cloud, have someone else worry about having mailbox replication, etc., etc. Now, this is not an extensive list of what's included in Exchange Online. As I mentioned, if you go to aka.ms/O365SD for Office 365 service description, it will go through and give you the limitations, the features, etc. And I've just listed some of the key ones that are important for people to understand here. So you get 50 gig limits per mailbox, so user mailboxes, resource mailboxes. Each public folder you create is treated as a mailbox. So you've got a 50 gig limit for each of these. So in a lot of cases, this is going to be larger than what a lot of organizations already allow on-prem. So it instantly means that it might give you a lot more breathing room versus trying to keep things much more restrained in an on-prem environment. Those of you who've worked with customers where you've had to keep mailbox sizes extremely small know that it's something that's not a great experience for the user. They spend a lot of time managing mailbox sizes. So this is something that instantly frees those users up to keep doing their jobs. Now we've got the ability to do mailbox recovery. We've still got deleted item recovery there as well. So the mailbox recovery is something we would handle as the admin, and the item recovery is something that the individual users can do. Now, when it comes to accessing Exchange Online, realistically, it's whatever client you've got that needs to connect in. As long as it's got support for any of the common standards there. You can see here that I've listed everything from web access to different mobile device synchronization technologies, POP support, IMAP, and if you do already have Outlook, then Outlook support means that you can just add your Exchange Online account to Outlook and start getting access to that. So what's important to note with this one is that even though it supports Outlook, this is just a plan for the online service. So there's no Office client or desktop licenses included with this one. So just bear that in mind if you're sort of thinking, well, does that mean I get Outlook? No, it doesn't mean you get Outlook. If you need Outlook and the latest versions of the Office apps, what you need to do in that case is go through and start looking at some of the business and enterprise plans that we'll talk about in just a moment. The other thing that's important with the Outlook support is that there'll be older versions of Outlook that are incompatible because they don't have support for auto discover built in. So just make sure that you are running a fairly current version of Outlook. And from a supportability perspective, at this point, it's still Realistic, or for now anyway, it's Outlook 2010 onwards are the supported versions. So you might get some functionality out of the earlier versions, but realistically, it's probably better to try to move the users forward. So as we take a look at the business plans, probably the main one to focus on here is the business premium plan. And what you can see here is that it ticks all the boxes, or should I say it dots all the boxes. This one gives us the Office desktop applications for installing onto PCs or Macs. We get iOS, Android, and Windows mobile apps so that we can deploy those onto a variety of different mobile devices. We get Office Online. We get OneDrive for Business with the large amount of storage that it provides. But we also then get the Exchange capabilities. We get Skype for Business capabilities. We get SharePoint Online. We get Yammer. So we really start getting a lot of additional functionality to allow organizations to communicate with each other. Now, sometimes people will say, but what do you mean by communicate? And it really depends on the organization. So it's not that common these days for everyone to always be in the office and still not be connected to each other. So this means that whether we're in the office and we can yell across the cubicle, or we're out at a customer location and we quickly need to see who's online so I can open up a quick IM window with them, these are all things that we can do very easily with that business premium plan with the capabilities that it provides. Now, if you take a look at the other two plans, we've got Business, which just provides the desktop apps piece, so all the applications license side, and the OneDrive for Business for cloud storage. And then you've got the Business Essentials product, which doesn't include the desktop apps, but includes the online services. So depending on what the customer wants to do, when it's time for an Exchange online conversation, depending on what the customer's requirements are, I'd probably also start thinking about whether that should be a business essentials conversation, because there we get that same, a lot of the same capabilities around Exchange mailboxes being 50 gig in size, etc. But we also then start getting all of the additional functionality that's there. So again, this is going to depend on what the customer requirements are, but I heavily suggest that you take a look at the different offerings there, and in a lot of cases for smaller businesses that are really looking at upgrading to a new environment, you might find that in a lot of those conversations that you might need to look at business premium anyway, because if they've got really old versions of Office, so they might have Office 2003 still, they might still have Office 2007. Looking at business premium as a way of moving forward is a much better way of doing it. And it's also important to understand that when you do talk about the desktop apps, it's 5 installations of those desktop apps for each user. So that means that that user could have it on if they've got a desktop machine in the office, if they've got a laptop, if they've got a home PC, they can actually go through and install it up to 5 times. So it gives you a lot of flexibility, and it makes sure that when you do talk to customers who are thinking about purchasing this, that they can start seeing the benefits around their users having the same version of Office available across all of the different devices, rather than jumping back and forth, seeing compatibility issues, getting confused about the differences in user interface, etc. This really starts to standardize on things for them. So next up, we've got some of the enterprise suites. Now, the main one here that is probably worth chatting to SMB customers about is the E3 plan. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the details here, but if you're talking to customers who are involved in legal, finance, medical, for example, and they start to have higher compliance requirements about data loss protection, around encryption, around stronger access controls, etc. These are things that the Enterprise E3 plan does offer. Now, from a pricing perspective, it's important to understand that it does come in at roughly twice the price of that business premium plan. So it's not going to be something for everyone, but it could even be in some organizations you mix and match between you can mix between the different product sets. So you might have some users that need these more advanced capabilities, while other people can really get by with entry level. So it means that you can pick and choose and custom build solutions that make more sense for that customer, and effectively, essentially for their budget as well, which is also a very important part of that conversation. So now that we've discussed some of the different Office 365 plans that are out there, What's important to note is that as we start looking towards the future, in this case with Windows Server 2016, it's currently sitting at technical preview number 5. You can download that from the TechNet Eval Center. So you can go there, just download, sign up or sign in with your Microsoft account if you haven't signed in there before. And the dashboard is very, very similar to the Windows Server Essentials dashboard we get today. But what we start getting are 2 additional features. So one of these is the Azure Virtual Network integration. So if you are looking at perhaps setting up some workloads in the cloud inside of Azure, and you want an easy way to connect up the VPN and the VPN gateway type technologies, this is something that Azure Virtual Network integration provides you. Now, the second option here, the Azure Site Recovery, is a way that you can start simplifying the process of having virtual machines moving into Azure from your on-prem environment. So effectively, replicas of those VMs will be pushed up into Azure, and then if you do have any kind of network outage locally, you can fire them up in Azure and basically have a replica of the network environment and the storage requirements that are needed, and have those workloads take over. And then when you do get your on-prem environment up and running again, then you can then synchronize the changes that you made back down to your local environment. So it really gives you some great ways to look at how you can have some type of a disaster recovery scenario, but still keep running while you're trying to get things up and running locally. And I guess this is probably good timing for this recording, because we've just had some major rain across the eastern seaboard over the last couple of days. So it really is those kinds of scenarios where people are like, okay, we need to shut everything down, we need to see what we can recover. That's where the site recovery integration is going to make a lot of sense for people. So now moving on, we're on the tail end of today's recording, so let's just focus on a few more things. So first up, the upcoming events. So the Microsoft Australia Partner Conference is happening on the 5th to the 8th of September on the Gold Coast. I'll be there along with other members of the Microsoft Australia OEM team and a lot of other people from Microsoft Australia. And it's not a technical event. This is more a matter of getting an idea of what's coming up over the coming year and what Microsoft Australia will be focused on. So if you're looking for direction, if you're thinking, well, what are the different promotions? What are the different teams doing? What are the different type of engines that I can hook into? The Australian Partner Conference will be the place to do that. So I strongly recommend that if that's something that you're thinking about doing, definitely sign up early, and you will get a lot out of that from a business perspective. Now, the second thing we've got here is Microsoft Ignite Australia 2017. So there's no Ignite 2016 in Australia this year because the US event was pushed out until quite late in the year. And that means that then the international events then need to have a flow-on effect after that. So we get the Australian version on the Gold Coast on the 14th to 17th of February, which hopefully means that that's a great enticement to get a lot of the Microsoft people from Redmond, where it's going to be the middle of winter, over to a nice Australian summer on the Gold Coast. So that means that for technical people that are looking to make great contact with local and overseas resources, find out what's happening with the latest technologies, if you're thinking about doing Microsoft certifications, etc., Ignite is a fantastic place to do those things. So I'll be involved with both of these events. So if it's something where you are interested in those, as it gets closer, we'll make sure that you know how to get a hold of us once we are there. But with Ignite, it really is the premier Australian technical event where there are a lot of sessions on a lot of different technologies. And as you can probably imagine, this year there'll be a big focus on things like what Windows Server 2016 starts allowing. So one thing to bear in mind is that this is something that a lot of the content at first glance may seem more enterprise focused, but remember that a lot of the time the enterprise technologies that they're talking about are also available in one form or another to SMB customers, especially when we look at things like Office 365, for example, where the size of the organization doesn't really limit the types of technologies that they can get access to. So wrapping up now, with the resources. So the first set of resources are the different websites that we've made available for you. So we've got Smart HQ, where I think most of you should be checking that regularly. You should be members signing up for the rewards program and seeing the different types of information that become available. And also, we've got the Microsoft Australia OEM team blog site, which I'm responsible for. And that's where you'll see we've got quite a heavy focus on Windows Server 2016 now, as well as some of the new Windows 10 capabilities that are coming up with the anniversary update. So we'll revisit some Windows 10 technology soon, because the anniversary update should be coming up within the next couple of months. But also, we are trying to do what we can to get you ramped up for Windows Server 2016 when that becomes available. Then finally, we've got the email alias for the OEM server products in Australia. So this is a pre-sales alias, so it's not something where we can take post-sales support questions. But if it's something where you're not sure if a particular feature is available in a particular Windows Server product available through OEM, you're looking at some assistance with what solution you should be selling to a customer. That's exactly what we look after in that with that email alias. And now the final piece is for those of you who haven't looked at Windows Server Essentials just yet, but are thinking that it's something that might be suitable for your customers and you really want to go through and learn a bit more about it. Obviously, you can go to sites like TechNet and read a lot of the articles that are available there. But if you're someone who prefers to go through online video content or video content you can download and then watch maybe in the morning when you're walking on a treadmill or riding a bike, not a push bike, a stationary bike. There's around 4 hours of video content on this one, and as you can see from the topics, it covers quite a few pieces here. So some of the elements that I had included in the beginning are things that this goes into in much more detail. So if it's something that it's your job or you've been told you need to learn a lot more about Windows Server Essentials, take a look at this because it will go a long way towards some of the readiness pieces that you need for Windows Server Essentials with Windows Server 2016 as well. So that brings us to the end of this month's video update. So thank you for joining us, and hopefully you got a few things out of it. And remember that if you've got feedback for us, please send it through to the OEM server alias we had on the last slide, and that way we can respond quickly. We're more than happy to go through and sometimes we do depend on you to suggest topics, talk about things that you're actually seeing out there in the marketplace to make sure we can get good customized information out there for you. So with that, I'd like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to you jumping on the next recording, which will be in the next financial year.